All right, let's get started. Hello, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining. I'm super excited for today's event. This is definitely the biggest crowd that we've had for any of our like online events or webinars. So very excited that you all are interested in this topic, which is very evergreen, but also very complicated, and excited to have a star roster of speakers from SoundExchange to help us unpack the wide world of Web3 and music rights. Quick thing about the chat, which I think we just enabled for everybody. Make sure that if you want to speak to the whole group, that you are sending messages to everyone and not just to hosts and panelists. I'm seeing a lot of the intros being sent just to us, which is awesome. Great to meet you all, but just pointing that out. Yeah, I'm actually not sure how to change the default to everyone, but just making note of that. And thanks also to the vast majority of you for filling out this poll. So before diving in, I definitely wanted to get a sense of who is in the proverbial room today in terms of like industry role, familiarity with Web3 and music rights, and just general sentiment on the topic. So I'm going to give like 10 seconds for people to finish filling out the poll, and then we'll kind of show everyone the results, just so that you all know who's joining us today. All right, I'm gonna close now. And let's look through the results. So yeah, in terms of like who's in the water music community, in case you are new to what we do, I'll dive into an intro in a bit, but it looks like we have a lot of startup founders, unsurprisingly, a lot of people in rights management as well. So super interesting. We have people on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, on this topic, in addition to a lot of artists and marketers as well. For the second question, it seems that people are, I'll combine the second and third questions combined. It seems people are definitely like more familiar with music rights, so coming more from music industry background. And then they have some familiarity with Web3. Definitely see a lot of familiar names in here of people who have been working on or building Web3 projects, have been doing that for a while. And there are some that are new. And so I'll definitely make sure we set aside some time to go over more foundational kind of information on what blockchain technology is and how it can benefit the music industry. And last but not least, I was most interested in answers to the last question of how people would describe their current sentiment on Web3 and music rights. It's very interesting that people here mostly seem neutral or higher, so neutral or optimistic, which especially in a bear market for Web3 is really intriguing and very cool to see that people are still interested in kind of opportunities to explore, use cases to explore around Web3 and music rights. And so we'll yeah, make sure to dive into a lot of those use cases in detail later. I will keep the polls up for a little bit more just for people to explore if they're curious. In case you don't know who I am, my name is Cherie Hu, and I am the founder of Water and Music. In case this is your first time attending one of our events, we are a research and intelligence network for the new music business. What does that mean? We put on a wide variety of projects and initiatives for the wider music and tech industries, from events like these, both online and offline, to online courses, a lot of newsletters, long-form research reports, and much more, all on a wider mission to make the music industry more innovative, cooperative, and transparent, and to empower people in the music and tech industries to do just more interesting, productive, and collaborative work with each other. Hopefully you all can see these slides. If you cannot see them, definitely let me know. In May of this year, May 2023, we hosted our first ever conference known as the Wavelength Summit in Bushwick, Brooklyn. This was a culmination of nearly a year of local events and meetups at various other conferences and cities around the world, and general planning around the importance of IRL networking and community building in our mission and in our thesis about truly innovative work in music and tech being very social and collaborative in this way. In terms of our programming, our summit featured highly interactive conversations and debates around topics ranging from legal and ethical issues with AI, to the role of Web3 in community building and artist strategy, to revisiting and rethinking fundamental assumptions about wider industry concepts like fandom and artist development. We also had a wide range of sponsors who very crucially made this event possible, including one of our flagship sponsors, SoundExchange, who's hosting this webinar with us today. SoundExchange is a US-based organization that collects and distributes digital performance royalties on behalf of 650,000 creators and growing. And to date, they have paid out over $10 billion in distributions to creators. As an organization, they're sitting in a really interesting spot right now at the intersection of music rights, especially, I guess, specifically performance rights, and both curiosity and active business development around emerging tech and new tech trends, including but not limited to Web3. I am very glad to be joined by two leaders from the SoundExchange team, Marc Rucker, who's the Associate Director of Industry Relations at SoundExchange, and Tommy Korpinen, who is the Chief Business Development Officer. We're going to be covering key opportunities, challenges, and debates in the world of Web3 and music IP, which has been a very hot topic of debate in the wider music community, as I'll dive into in the next couple of slides. And we'll also cover some solutions SoundExchange is exploring to help founders and developers in particular navigate the complex music rights landscape. As far as our agenda, just so you know how we're going to spend the next hour and a half. So we have until 2:30 p.m. Eastern. I'm going to do some context setting just in terms of the history of music and Web3, which we really cannot talk about without talking about rights. So we'll have a few slides about that. And then the panel discussion will kind of start with fundamental questions around blockchain as a technology and its benefits and limitations. And then we'll dive into some specific use cases around Web3 and music rights and advice for artists and founders looking to navigate or build around those use cases. We'll leave at least 15 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. As a logistical note, if you'd like to submit a question, please use Zoom's Q&A feature and don't just leave it in the chat. There's a good chance that it might get kind of lost in the wider noise around the chat, which we definitely want to keep, more interactive. So if you have a question, as soon as right now, you can submit it via the Q&A feature, and we'll curate and synthesize questions from there. And also we have team members moderating the chat. So if you have any technical or logistical issues navigating this webinar, definitely give us a shout and we're happy to help. So let's start by putting this wider discussion in context and kind of framing the problems faced around the conversation of music and Web3 by dividing the history of music and Web3 into three historical phases in the last, say, 8 to 10 years. Crucially, and I think this is actually something that a lot of especially newer entrepreneurs or artists in the music Web3 landscape may not know, is that you cannot talk about the origin story of music and Web3 without talking about rights. Around 2015, 2017, there were many early experiments revolving around using the blockchain to store and manage and display music rights and credits metadata on chain. Some examples that you all may know include Ujo Music, Jack, and the Open Music Initiative at Berklee College of Music. And so putting rights on chain and kind of uniting the industry and building consensus around this use case was a primary driving factor behind a lot of these startups. Unfortunately, no truly durable or financially sustainable venture came out of this first phase of experimentation. And a lot of the challenges, which we'll dive into, are mostly political, actually. There are a lot of difficulties of getting very large incumbent stakeholders to agree to share data with each other, let alone put that data on chain for all to see. There are a lot of existing data issues within the music industry in terms of just gaps in ownership or credit information, where putting them on chain wouldn't fix the problem, it would just make them more permanent. And then, of course, very relatable to today also in terms of challenges the Web3 landscape faces, there are a lot of UX issues in terms of building applications and experiences in Web3 that could onboard people smoothly to a new application, as opposed to being very clunky and fragmented like much of the landscape was then and still is today. When Water Music started tracking music NFT sales trends more consistently in early 2021, we noticed a wholly different shift in approach. It was much less about trying to get the incumbent industry to put data on chain. Rather, it was about independent artists intentionally circumventing traditional ways of monetizing music IP, especially streaming, which was just not financially serving them, and instead experimenting with music NFTs specifically as a way to earn revenue directly from collectors, fans, and investors. And importantly, embracing this idea of digital scarcity around music, art, and reputation around an artist. This also was a very financialized use case. This Grimes NFT being a prime example. It was very commonplace in kind of early 2021 to see NFTs selling for 6 figures for a single edition. Obviously, we are in a very different place right now. We're in a big transition period. We're in a bear market. There have been tons of high-profile scandals and scams that have led to a mass exodus of investors and therefore of capital and collectors as well. At Water Music, we've covered severe drops in music NFT prices to as little as 1 cent per NFT, which kind of exacerbates existing industry issues at that point of, from the artist's perspective, wanting to, or trying to achieve a mass amount of scale to even break even on a drop, let alone earn a profit. That said, this has led to, I think, also another shift in mindset towards thinking about music NFTs not just as quick cash grabs or investment vehicles, but rather as just one technological option in the wider toolbox that artists, brands, and labels can use to grow their businesses, generate new revenue, and connect with new fans and audiences. This is the context, I think, in which almost every single major rights holder in music is entering into Web3 seriously and building out a long-term Web3 strategy, in many cases for the first time in 2023. And this includes, but certainly is not limited to, SoundExchange, which we'll dive into very shortly. The question then remains, though, whether we're still at square one on rights in Web3 for music. The issue is still very, very highly disjointed. There's still lots of issues around coordinating various stakeholders in terms of getting rights together on chain. There have been a lot of royalty-based, royalty-backed NFT offerings, which we'll dive into kind of later in today's discussion, where the kind of the business case in terms of the returns and also like the legal grounding is arguably still in question. There's also a challenge more on the back end of connecting on and off chain transactions, especially if you're interested in like using Web3 to manage and pay out, off chain traditional music rights. Still very much difficult. Not to even mention like going into different kinds of music copyrights, like performance versus sound recordings, which I'm sure will come up today given SoundExchange's positioning in the landscape. And this was actually one of the biggest points of contention in the Water Music community. I think we have a Discord server for our members, and the most active day of all time was around December, January, like winter 2022, so December going to January this year, where there was a lot of debate around whether like music NFTs that are listened to, especially on like aggregators that are combining these NFTs, should be paying out streaming royalties. And so whether they should be more directly integrated with traditional music rights and payment frameworks. We published a community synthesis, kind of combining a lot of perspectives from our community on this topic, and I'll send out this link to everybody after this webinar concludes, just so you can read it in full. But what was interesting in terms of like where everyone aligned was that, I'll actually just read this quote from the synthesis. There is no need for tech innovation and copyright law to be at odds. Established law serves as guidelines that can help music innovation thrive. Even though relevant legal frameworks often arrive on a delayed timeline, technological innovation is not outside the scope of governing law. So as the music Web3 landscape kind of matures and evolves, there's been kind of growing sentiment or growing agreement that the law still exists. It definitely is a risk, but also something just to be mindful of. And from like a rights and IP perspective, some people, I mean, clearly people in this proverbial room from the polls see it as an opportunity to build better Web3 projects, applications, and experiences. So yeah, just I guess to close out this introductory section, the wider overarching meta question is how exactly we can envision Web3 and blockchain technology integrating with traditional notions of music copyright law and the roles that major rights holders and rights organizations like SoundExchange will play in that process. With that, let's transition to the panel discussion. And so now I'm going to ask that Marc and Tommy, I didn't stop sharing the poll, sorry about that. I'm going to ask that Marc and Tommy turn on their videos, if you're able to.
We can't turn them on. You need to turn
you can't turn them on. Let me.
I'm happy to, but it's giving me a pop-up.
Give me 1 second. Sorry, everyone. Stay put. Okay, can you try now?
There we go. Perfect.
There we go. Amazing.
Excellent.
Okay, sorry about that. Hello, both. Thank you again for joining us. I gave a very brief introductory spiel about SoundExchange earlier, but as a matter of introduction, would love for you both to introduce yourselves, like mention what role exactly you play at SoundExchange, and then as a specific Web3 related follow-up, I guess talk through like your overarching outlook on the Web3 landscape right now, kind of what you're most excited to dive into in your work with respect to like engaging with the landscape.
That's great.
Tommy, go for it.
All right, so first of all, good morning to everyone from Los Angeles. Good afternoon if you're on the East Coast. Good later evening, wherever you are in the world. It was great to see such a diverse attendance today from different parts of the world. So nice to meet you all. Well, first of all, before I go into an intro of myself, I just want to say a big thank you to Water and Music for hosting this webcast today and for asking us at SoundExchange to be a part of the fun. We're really looking forward to this. And, you know, kind of as you mentioned, Cherie, you know, these webcasts are really valuable, not just in the way that they inform people and give us the ability to share these thoughts, but it helps us create a community around topics that are really central and important to the industry. So thank you for that, Cherie. We appreciate it. And great to see a number of familiar faces in the crowd as well. So getting to your question, Cherie, so quick intro on myself. My name is Tommy Korpinen. I'm the Chief Business Development Officer over at SoundExchange. In a nutshell, my remit is to look for new revenue opportunities and looking at new partnerships and business partnerships for the business. I've been doing business development for about 20 odd years, specifically in digital music, as well as TV, film, and gaming. So I have a pretty interesting background in the sense that I've looked at the challenges that many of these content industries face from various different angles, mostly from a commercial perspective for me. But like I said, at SoundExchange, we're trying to look for new opportunities and new ways to partner in the market to solve some of these challenges that we've seen in the past. So I think that's kind of my background. I'll pass it over to Marc.
Yeah, thanks, Tommy. And yeah, just to reiterate, Cherie, thank you again. As I've said to you before, I was a big Water Music fan when you guys first started, and it's so cool to be a part of these conversations. But quick intro on me, I'm the Associate Director of Industry Relations, and I'm based here in Nashville right now. I basically, part of my role is to help artists and creators understand what this right is around the digital performance royalty. How do they get paid? Why do they get paid? How does it work? Talking with their teams, whether it's a rights owner or a producer or whatever, and kind of coming from the angle of, you know, I spent the last 15 years as an artist manager and understanding that the business isn't as simple as what we want it to be. It could be straightforward in some ways, but it's not. And I think one thing that brought me to SoundExchange was really seeing the importance of it as we went through the pandemic, and understanding that there were lots of artists that weren't getting paid in certain areas, and SoundExchange was the one place that they could really come back to and say, hey, every single month that check keeps coming in. And as a manager, it's about finding those opportunities and exploiting them, and figuring out how to use them better. And so a quick background as well, like during that time, and I'm sure just like most people, that's when I started kind of getting interested in this Web3 space and getting involved in projects, and kind of seeing how NFTs were working. And I think a lot of this conversation for me comes back to having a genuine curiosity into where we're going and why we're going there, and also finding the fairest, most equitable, solutions for creators and artists, and how they can, put their products out there and their music and be compensated fairly. And that's one of the biggest goals I think SoundExchange is obviously a part of as well. So I'm happy to be here.
Cool. Thanks so much, both. I guess as a starting question, and a lot, you'll see a lot of how I'm framing these questions is I'm just being very curious about your response, or SoundExchange's stance in particular, on kind of what we've seen to be a very polarizing topic of whether Web3 and music rights like fit well together. I kind of alluded to this in my slides, but I think very widely held perception across the industry is that blockchain in its current form only adds, or one, like it's can be very confusing, and it only adds friction to the value chain of music, especially thinking about music rights, as opposed to making things more seamless, smoother, and more efficient. So I'm curious, with based on your knowledge of blockchain and your view on the landscape, where, if anywhere, do you feel like blockchain can genuinely add value and make things easier, especially thinking from the artist creator perspective, which you both are dealing with day to day?
Mark, I can maybe kind of start off, and then we can just tag team on this one. I think it's a really, really good question. To answer it, I think from a SoundExchange perspective, I think it would behoove everyone to kind of understand also sort of what we do on a day-to-day basis in the Web2 space, because obviously that for SoundExchange creates core competencies that we feel that we can then take from our day-to-day work in the Web2 space, and then move over to the Web3 environment as well. And as you pointed out, Cherie, we're in the business of collecting and distributing digital performance royalties. And what we do basically is we collect and run billions of lines of data a month from the industry. And then we collect that data, we cross-reference that data, we check for clarity, and then we generate outbound payments to the folks that need to get paid for their work. So in a nutshell, I guess you could say SoundExchange basically, we disseminate vast amounts of information. We ensure that IP is represented correctly in these transactions, and then we correctly attribute and pay royalties in distributions and in different payments to artists. And so, to kind of answer your question, if we look at that as a baseline for where SoundExchange is in its current incarnation in Web 2, then we start looking at, okay, what is uniquely interesting to SoundExchange in the blockchain space? And I'd have to say, the first thing that for me, from a personal perspective, is interesting is decentralization. And it's not a very clear concept to a lot of people, even in our industry. When we talk about this, and it gets a lot of different reactions in terms of what it means and how it should be approached. But basically, from our perspective, and one of the key things that interests me, it creates an ability for artists to directly connect with their fans, and then also create transactions that are peer-to-peer. So really changing the value chain of the industry. And from a SoundExchange perspective, how do we kind of look at our potential role in that space? Well, it's comes from our core, which is managing the intellectual property rights, making sure that payments are correct, and folks ultimately get paid in a transparent and trustful way. And so the kind of interesting spin-off from that is, okay, well, if that's kind of a focus, then how do you think that that's going to be done? Well, one of the areas that we're looking at, and we're talking to a number of different players out there, and I'd love to talk to anyone, by the way, on the webcast today who is in this space, is looking at smart contract administration and looking at the data that goes into these smart contracts at the very sort of formation stage of smart contracts. I think that's a really, really important fundamental piece, making sure that intellectual property is managed and rights are managed correctly from the get-go. There's a lot of different things as well. Tokenization, I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit about that later, Cherie. I think it's an interesting aspect to us, and again, we've been talking to a number of different folks about how that's managed. And also, if you're in that business, and if you're in the business of any type of tokenomics, to use buzzwords here, looking at, you know, what the value chain is, and potentially taking one key part of what SoundExchange does, which is the outbound payment piece, and managing that for different stakeholders there. So I think that's really key. And then really the last point from me before I hand it over to Mark is data privacy. And I think, you know, there's a lot that that blockchain can bring to this in all its transparency. It can also create data privacy from a perspective of having greater control over one's assets, personal and financial, across the board. And again, this is something that SoundExchange has done very well for the folks that it represents in the Web2 space. And there are opportunities for us to work with folks on the blockchain-based opportunities as well as Web3. But those are the sort of the things that I'm looking at right now. But I'll pass it over to Mark to continue.
Yeah, I think kind of just to add on to that and kind of put some context numbers around even what SoundExchange does. I think you had mentioned this before. I mean, we process 35 billion performances every month. It's a lot of data, a lot of pieces moving through. 90% of our royalties are matched and sent within 45 days. So we've moved pretty quick, but obviously there's still opportunity to move faster and be able to get payments to be quicker and better for royalties, you know, make sure that artists are getting everything correctly. Even just data submission is honestly like always a problem. It's a really interesting kind of subsect of like where I feel like creators might not put as much importance into their, you know, data health. And, you know, when that happens, we have issues with connecting them and making sure that they're correct. And so that takes time. And so we're hopeful that, you know, opportunities within blockchain or within the tools that could be provided could give us that access to, you know, having the original owner. And it actually makes it a lot easier and a lot more straightforward on, you know, where does this come from, or where does this ownership go to? You know, can we split this out? Those types of things that I think we're starting to see at its infancy where this could go. And, you know, not everybody's, you know, going along with it, but I think in a lot of ways, it kind of what Tommy was saying, it provides a lot of freedom for the creator to decide, this is what I would like to do with my ownership and my stake in this. And I think that's a really important piece for us, as, you know, we want to be the best advocate we can for all creators and all rights owners. And that's what we're here to do.
Amazing. So many follow-up questions on all those points. So thanks both. I guess first so this is most related to the use cases around like smart contracts, and I guess the metadata level, just having that clear data on who owns what part of which right in a given piece of music. Going back to an earlier slide about how a lot of I guess earlier experiments around music and Web3 and rights, so say, you know, 8 to 10 years ago, mostly fizzled out. I'm curious why either of you might think that is the case, and are those kinds of solutions that you are actively exploring, or are you maybe trying to approach the music rights picture in Web3 from a slightly different angle, given those lessons?
Yeah, maybe I can kick it off again here. I mean, it's interesting. There's a time and place for everything, right? And sometimes being, you know, very early with a very innovative idea is the most challenging place, right? Because Not only do you have to sell the concept internally, but you have to sell it externally, and you have to find and start creating a community of believers and all of that. And we've seen that as the music industry, has evolved through a number of different technologies over the years. SoundExchange, actually, this year is our 20th anniversary. We're 20 years young, but we were originally created for the digital economy. We were created for the digital business. And even in our 20-year path here, we've had to adapt to different technologies along the way. And when we start looking at things that the industry tends to gravitate towards, then a couple of things have to hold true, right? There has to be, for many of the folks in what I say, well, I guess I would call current value chain, as you pointed out, Cherie, earlier, there's a rights component and a legal component. So some of those things have to be addressed and adhered to. There's also a whole concept of scale. It needs to make enough sense for folks to go start contributing to it. And sometimes when you're at the very early stage of this and you have a brilliant idea, some of these questions can be really, really challenging. And I've seen this time and time again in my 20-year career in business development, music and film. And it's really, timing is crucial as well to be able to get that scale. So I think that's one of those things that we'd have to pay attention to. Having said that, now as we're talking about Web3, we're talking about blockchain. Your intro slides addressed 3 different phases, and I thought those were pretty nicely laid out, like the early adopter stage, then we got into the hype stage, and then we got grounded with reality, basically your 1, 2, 3 steps there. And I think that depicts kind of where we are. And even with everything from the past year and a half here with crypto winter and all of that, I think there's some benefits, there's lessons learned there. And also when we look at who's left standing, as you pointed out, a lot of bad players and things like this were weeded out. And now we're in this space where, we have folks who are very serious about this space, and in many cases, well-funded to move these things forward. And they have the ear of the industry. And it's a really, really interesting spot for the industry to be in at this very particular point in time when it comes to Web3 and the associated rights. So we're trying to capitalize that from a SoundExchange perspective, using our sort of unique position in the music industry. We're kind of like the Switzerland of the music industry, right? We're positioned in the middle, and we work with the creative community as well as the different rights owners, from bigger majors to independent artists, and their representation in different ways. And so we're trying to capitalize on this very particular point in time and look at what our next chapter would be. So with that said, I'll pass it over to Marc.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, Tommy. I think we're obviously in a place now where I think we have a lot more data and and experimentation that's happened, from the early days till now. And I also think there's a pretty big movement just in the digital rights for people in general, let alone just music. I think there's a lot of things that are happening in this moment. And I think for us, as part of the music business, is kind of maybe looking at it from an honest perspective and going like, are we doing the best that we can for the people that are creating the art that we are all enjoying every single week? And I think from the perspective of me as someone that's, been in the industry for a long period of time on the creator side and representing them directly, and then now to be in the position that we're in now with SoundExchange and understanding that, we can be a part of this conversation, and we should be. It's a responsibility as much as it is, anything else about developing or anything like that. And I think for me, I want to be as up to date about this as possible. So I would say that for me personally, I think a lot of the previous, iterations of this maybe didn't work because it wasn't the right timing or the right people involved, and also wasn't the right timing in the way that the world works. And I think kind of going back to one of your earlier slides, which, I'll mention this later as far as advice, but, I think one thing that I've learned is how much, congressional buy-in and incumbency buy-in really does matter. And as much as we want to be, kind of entrepreneurial with it. And I'm the same way. And I have artists around me all the time that want to be this way, but we do have to kind of work within the confines that what we're playing in, and at least kind of be in the same field or the same stadium, trying to play the same game. And I think in some ways we need to kind of bridge that gap. And I know a lot of people use that Web 2.5, iteration, but I think in some ways, looking backwards, we're trying to skip over that. And now this feels more like we're kind of meeting in the middle. And how can we make sure that these are, meeting at the right time in the right place?
For sure. Yeah, we'll definitely touch upon the policy implications later on. I already see some audience questions about that. So definitely, yeah, we'll bring that up. Marc, follow-up question for you, because you spend a lot of your time and also a lot of your background is working directly with especially independent artists and creators. Yeah, I had a slide about how definitely like the new or more recent wave is very much driven by activity from that group of people in the industry. And I think it's safe to say they were really leading the way on like use cases and setting precedents for the technology, even more than like maybe the like kind of bigger rights holders or labels. I'm curious in terms of like things that you would like to see in blockchain / Web3 apps that are being built in a way that is best serving these artists and creators' needs. What sorts of things are you advocating for? And are there any like gaps that you still see in the market right now in terms of like just features or tooling that you think would be useful?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, I guess I would just say that the continual education on both sides, understanding that, an artist might be doing, releasing music in Web 2, but, might 20x their business by releasing in Web 3, and they need to understand why. Well, how did I do that? Or, how do you know kind of where your fans are? And I think that kind of going back to the idea of understanding your fan base and understanding the feedback that you get and responding to that. And I would say that to the same as like a founder of a business where, if you sign up 100 artists and 75 of them have the same question, clearly you have a problem in the way that you've built this thing out. So you need to work on that. And I think that's what I guess right now, I think the biggest tools that we need is to make sure that artists understand where they currently are, and so that they can move forward in a different direction or an associated direction. And I think, honestly, connected networks like Water and Music is a great place to kind of find those resources and that community that you might not normally have. Many of the artists that I talk to feel very, alone in their business model and what they do. And they feel like I have to kind of keep everything secretive, because if I do that, if I don't do that, then everyone's going to kind of know what I'm doing. And I think in the scenario that we're in, as far as the industry goes, is that, the sense of abundance is kind of where we need to be headed. And I think the Web3 space kind of gives us that opportunity to experiment and to try things and to learn from others. The Web 2 space has kind of become less and less of that. You kind of copy people rather than learning from them. And so I'm hopeful that, moving forward, we can look at Web 3 as an opportunity to continue to experiment and learn. And those tools will continue to be built out based on the responses and the feedback that creators are giving, whether you're a musician or a comedian or an actor or whatever it is. There's so many different tools out there that could be helpful in experimenting. And I think it's important to go further down that road.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that quick, just clarification question. What you're saying, like helping artists understand where they're at, is that almost in like a Web3 agnostic way, but including Web3? So just like understanding their like fuller financial picture. Is that what you were envisioning? Or
yeah, I think, yeah, I would say in a general sense, yeah, honestly, I think it's hard to kind of know where you want to go if you don't know where you're starting. And, whether you're an artist in Web 2 or Web 3, or you kind of look at them singularly. I know I've talked to several artists that have a Web 2 manager and a Web 3 manager. They're separate. And I think in some ways that can be helpful. And I think in other ways, obviously you can have differing agendas based off of those two things. So I think it's about understanding where you want to go based on where you're starting.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for clarifying. For, I guess, the next couple of questions, want to shift from the use case of like storing rights data on chain to what I think a lot of people, especially in this crowd, might be interested in, equally if not more interested in, which is whether blockchain can be used as a tool to rethink or reinvent the way that we license out rights or like kind of share revenue around rights at large. Specifically, like two use cases that a lot of people are interested in, but also there's been a lot of debate around are royalty-backed NFTs, as I mentioned earlier. And also, I've noticed like tokenized licensing models have come up, where, for example, if you own an NFT, you're granted usage or remix rights on a piece of music. I'm seeing that happen a lot, especially in the independent community. I'm curious for both of your stances on that and kind of how you might see that evolve, or whether you see any opportunities to kind of using blockchain to facilitate rethinking the underlying deal structures, I guess the way licensing works, as opposed to just the data layer.
Yeah, I guess I can kick that off again. And, ultimately what we're talking about here is either a brand new value chain or a value chain that supports the existing market dynamics and carries those over to Web3. And at SoundExchange, we're kind of open to having both conversations right now. The cool thing about this is there is no manual. And the challenging part about this is that there is no manual. So it's like it's the both sides of the coin. But from our perspective, when and maybe taking a step back, Cherie, and sort of saying, what are the areas specifically that we're interested in? Well, one of the things that we're looking at and talking to a number of different partners out there. Unfortunately, I got NDAs with most of the players, so I can't use names specifically. But we're looking at distribution, and we're looking at decentralized distribution opportunities and how SoundExchange could provide either support in on the IP side. So looking at data services, what kinds of information, either on the sound recording side, on the publishing side, or then what we call at SoundExchange music administration services or music administrative services, which is actually providing the use of our existing technology infrastructure to support, as an example, outbound payments, IP management, license management, those types of things. We've created a lot of technology for what we're doing in our Web2 space. And as Marc pointed out, this is a very prolific area of our business. And there are areas that we could use from that space and work with many folks on the Web3 space. So distribution was one of them. Also working directly with independent artists and managing sort of, again, the IP and the infrastructure side of that. On the tokenization side, working with and having conversations with a number of different players in the wallet space, looking at how payments are managed and how payments should flow on the chain and what kind of a role needs to exist there. Certainly also looking at the intellectual property rights management piece of this, which kind of refers to the smart contract side again, which is, who needs to get, how they need to get paid. And this is a huge part of what we do currently. We know who needs to get paid under what splits in what area, and also we have the relationship with them to manage the payment. So again, it's something that we've talked to a number of partners from a tokenization perspective and a wallet perspective. Also, obviously, we're talking about the blockchain, and we're talking about Web3. It is a direct-to-consumer platform to a large extent. So, and Marc can elaborate on this, but how do we work with creators, artists out there to actually enable them from a technology perspective to be more creative and actually get, how should I word this? To be more creative and to be more prolific and do what they're so passionate about in creating their arts. And then my last point on this one, really, in terms of specific examples, there are a lot of companies out there that are creating completely new music tools and completely new music assets. And these are new music categories. And they come with a different set of rights. They come with a different set of ownership structures. They come with a lot of different things like this. And we're working with a number of different partners out there to try to make sense of that, how those should be managed. Are they completely managed on the chain? Are they partially managed on the chain? Do we manage them through smart contract implementation, et cetera, et cetera? So really the right side of it when it comes to these new assets. But yeah, Mark, that's all I got. Your turn.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna add in. I mean, obviously, when you kind of look at, whether it's an NFT that has, royalties attached to it, or some form of, you have rights to using it. I think in some ways, it's such a benefit to that independent artist that doesn't have a team, but they might have a fan base. I think your fans can actually participate in a much deeper way, and whether it's a fan or an investor or a friend, I think you can incentivize people in different ways, which, do I think that that's going to be eventually the long-term answer? I don't know. Fans have never really wanted to make money from their favorite artist, but I think in some ways it could provide some benefits that maybe you never thought would be there. And, I think in some ways it also kind of shows a little bit of the way that the streaming model is right now, where creators might not feel like they receive enough royalties from it. And I think fans are seeing how that feels in that as well. I think being upfront and honest with fans about what they can actually expect to see. I think, over the last couple of years, we've seen some of these producer royalties or something that's come out where it's a really, really small percentage, and it kind of makes it feel a little bit different than what it maybe really is. But I'm hopeful that in a much different perspective, that artists can more or less fundraise through something like that, to go to their top 100 fans, their top 1,000 fans, and say, hey, like, this album's only for you guys, and I want to build this for you. And I think there's actual practical ways to do that currently already. And I hope that any artist or manager that's listening is kind of looking at that as an opportunity to go, well, let's find out who these 100 fans are and see what they would like and how we can super serve them, because 50% of your business will probably come from your top 20% of fans, regardless of what you try to do differently. And so I think that's a big part for me. And then, I think kind of just continuing down to that tokenization point of understanding that, for me, I've been able to get involved in a couple of different projects that have given me experience in it, and going like, wow, like, that's how that actually works. And that's how we can show people. I've been able to show more people in the industry how this works by experimenting in it myself. It's hard to explain, and it's hard to do that. And I understand that, like, does it pass the grandparents test where you have to try to explain to them what you're doing? Not all the time. And I definitely understand that's that friction point that I think we all kind of go up against. But I will say that for me, it starts clicking further and further. The more I do it, the more I get exposed to it, and the more I see it. And when you hold it in your hands, or you have it in your own wallet, and you see this recurring, statement that's coming through, and you're like, wow, that's such a wild concept that, for me, 2.5 years ago, didn't even seem possible. So I think in a lot of ways, we're still at that infancy point. I love that artists and creators are experimenting in this space and utilizing it in ways that most people probably never thought was going to be possible. And so I hope that we keep going down that path.
And
well,
Cherie,
thank you so much.
Cherie, let me just add to that as well. I think it's, what really gets me excited about this. I mean, these are new revenue streams, and these are new products, right? So specifically answering a question about royalty-backed NFTs, I mean, it really creates an incentive for creators to create more, right? They can see immediate results from their actions. It gives them, more traction with their fan base, and creates that affinity. And I think that's really, really, really exciting from an industry perspective. And then, looking at this from a commercial perspective, as is my role, these are innovative revenue models, and the script hasn't been written on any of these. So there's so many different ways to structure these deals, and sort of new approaches to how these could be structured. That's really exciting to us. And again, from a SoundExchange perspective, where can we play a role in this? And it really is, I look at it from the back end perspective of being able to support the technology that actually does this. And then also be a voice, as Mark mentioned, to the creative community. We have that 650 to 700,000 strong creator base, which is a huge music industry professional database of folks that we can work with. So those are kind of the things I just wanted to add that really kind of get me excited as well, more from the commercial perspective.
Yeah, thank you both. I mean, definitely a trend that I think is a huge takeaway for me, and I know has been a theme in a lot of wider music Web3 discussions, is that, Marc, as you were saying, also like leaning into what genuinely makes Web3 different and unique, like not just as a technology, but also as a culture of being very direct to fan, direct to community member, as opposed to just having to lean back and hope you'll get your royalties. Like that can be part of the picture, but definitely arguably not what makes Web3 as a culture unique. Tommy, I had a follow-up question for you on the use case or the opportunity you mentioned around decentralized distribution that you were exploring. I know you said you have NDAs, so you can't mention specific companies, but I think there's in the water music community and in the music industry, there's a lot of debate around say if a larger rights holder, rights org is stepping into the Web3 picture, at what point do they kind of help process and distribute payments? Specifically, there's been a lot of debate about whether they should be taking a piece of a sale of an NFT tied to an artist or a piece of work or a song or recording, or if the deals end up looking more like traditional quote unquote Web2 deals with streaming platforms where you're just monetizing the Web2 consumption and not kind of the Web3 purchase. How are you thinking about those different options, whatever you're able to share?
Well, I think, I kind of alluded to it before. I mean, most of the things that we're trying to look at from a SoundExchange perspective is we try to be neutral to the various different stakeholders in the industry, and we try to support those different strategies that inevitably people will have. Different rights holders, independent artists with no representation, et cetera, et cetera. They're all going to have their different types of approaches. And from a SoundExchange perspective, we're not taking sides in terms of, this is the way it should be or shouldn't be, but we're looking at opportunities to support, the creative community as a whole. And so if that means working with larger rights holders to make sure that, their best interests are taken care of, or if it makes if we're working with the independent community to make sure that their interests are taken care of, we try to kind of balance that out in everything that we do. Ultimately, our mantra, which I mentioned in the beginning, is to make sure that folks that are doing the work get compensated fairly for their work. And that's what we've been doing in Web3 and Web2 very successfully, and we see our role being that in potentially being in the Web3 space as well. So that's the $1 million question, right, Cherie? It's a really tough question to answer. But I think, where there's opportunity and there's interest, there's also a way to figure out, what the model should be on the different services that are being provided. And again, they're all unique. Most of them are very different from each other. And so they need to be treated basically on a case-by-case basis.
Cool. Yeah, thank you for elaborating on that. For people in the audience, just giving a 5 to 10 minute time check before we go into audience questions. There are already a lot of really, really good ones, so thanks so much everyone for submitting, but just want to encourage people to keep sharing questions. And there are already a lot of common themes, so I'll try to kind of synthesize a lot of questions at once so that we can go through as many as possible. But yeah, I just wanted to give a time check for that. My next question is building off of, I think Marc, or I guess the point that both of you made just about the importance of education in both directions, for the music industry about blockchain, for Web3, blockchain founders and developers about the music industry. I'm curious, what are some common misconceptions that you're finding in either direction? So as you're, maybe Marc, as you're, talking to artists about how Web3 works, any common misconceptions that come to mind, or Tommy, as you're talking to founders as well. Very curious.
Yeah, Web3 is not all rug pulls and PFPs, so we'll just start there. No, I think obviously people watch the news, they read the news, and that's as far as their education goes, and that's why for me I think it's about continually trying to stay involved, get involved, and stay involved. Be a part of a community. Understanding that, again, a water music Discord is such a friend to anybody that wants to try to learn this stuff, because you can find a group within the group that can help you and you can become closer with. And for me, that's what I've been able to find through this. So I think in the music business, we have in the Web2 industry, there's a lot of misconceptions around, it's all crypto punks and Bored Apes, and that's all we're working on. And isn't it a bear market? And then you just like kind of go down this rabbit hole. And then on the flip side of that, and this is something I think in a lot of ways, even in the music business, I think we have a misconception of what I was saying before is how difficult IP and data management really is. And then also how important it is to work and educate congressional leaders in the best way possible. Because I think SoundExchange kind of represents both of those for me. Once I joined, I started getting to meet these, meet some of these leaders that, when you're having these conversations, you have to realize that they have to pass the grandparents test, where you're talking about how do you make money in music, or how does music work currently? And when you're going through those conversations and you have experience in it, you kind of feel like, for me, I've felt, like I can kind of go over their head a little bit, and I'm talking about experiences that might not hit them. And then I realize that I have to make sure that this is important to them. How can I explain this in a way that shows that this is connected to everything that we do? And I think kind of going what Tommy was saying, I mean, our entire point is to find these fair solutions for creators to make sure that they're equitably being paid for their work. And I think for us, it's about even understanding where these creators are. And I think self-education is a big part of it for me. Asking creators, what is a problem that you have? What's something that you're working on right now that maybe others aren't? That type of thing is also important to me. And so, yeah, I think just from those are some of the bigger misconceptions on both sides.
Yeah, and I'll elaborate with a couple of them. I agree 100%. And working with a lot of startups, working with a lot of folks entering the business, maybe coming from a completely different background, overlooking the complexity of rights management is one thing that folks maybe get a little bit wrong. The intricacies of rights management, licensing, copyright ownership, and royalty distribution. Those are tough, and those are big questions. And thankfully, there are folks like SoundExchange that work in this particular space day in, day out. And I would encourage folks to come and reach out to us and have conversations with us about, okay, how can we help manage these particular conversations? How can we help manage as I've alluded to in previous answers, the sort of the technology backbone of what you guys are trying to do. But I think overlooking that complexity is something that a lot of folks need to consider. Then the other one, which I kind of playfully say, and I can say because I've worked at the labels myself for many years, is having this assumption of everyone in the industry is tech savvy. They're not. These are marketing and distribution. To a large extent, it's marketing and distribution is what the industry does. And when we, even if I look at the sort of the participants on this the webcast here today, you guys are at the forefront of this new emerging technology, and it's it's day to day to you. But when you're talking to many folks in, be it labels or publishers or even individual rights owners, technology is not simple, and it's just something to consider that not everyone is as advanced as you. So keeping those conversations and educating not only yourself, but also educating the other folks that you're going to meet. And then I guess just the last thing that I'd kind of say is a misconception is that it's difficult to talk to the industry. It's actually not. There are a lot of folks who will entertain these conversations. You just have to find the right people. And, SoundExchange is a great example of that. As I've mentioned, we were born digital. Our technology was built for the digital space. We're looking around the corner as to what the next iteration of the creative experience and the creative experience and the consumer's creative experience is. And we're very happy to have those conversations with any and all. So those are kind of the three that I'd just like to add to what Marc was saying.
Cool, thank you so much. I feel like you all were starting to address last question I had for you both before moving to audience questions, I guess, is just general advice. It seems like, not treating Web3, not treating the music industry as a monolith in general. is always very sound advice. But I'm curious, especially for like say founders, I recognized tons of, up and coming Web3 and music rights startups in the audience and in our RSVP list. Any other advice that you might have for them as they are tackling this very complex but very important topic? If either of you want to take that.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. Mark and I talked a little bit about this earlier, and I think one of the key things that, having worked in the music industry over the past 2 decades is, where does innovation kind of come from? Where do these new models come from? Yes, I mean, they can be born on anyone's desk, but really they come from the creators and they come from the fans. So one of the key things that I'd say to anyone looking to get into music is have a pulse, have an understanding of what the fans want, speak to the creators, speak to the creative community, understand what they need to be able to work with the creative community. From a SoundExchange perspective, it's protecting intellectual property rights is a big deal for us, and we'll continue to fight for the rights of and the fair treatment of creators and their value chain. That's really the core of what we do, and I'd sort of urge everyone getting into the space to make sure that you're working with the intellectual property rights and understand the limitations there, and look, many folks actually want to push the boundaries, and so let's have those conversations, but let's also be smart about how we approach that. And then the last thing I'd say, having worked with, quite a few startups and having had one myself, is start small and experiment. And, small conversations sometimes lead to huge opportunities. And so don't be shy to share, don't be shy to collaborate, and really reach out to different players in the industry to have these conversations on what your solution, what your service, what your objective could potentially help in terms of the music industry. So those would be kind of the 3 or 4 things that I would put forth. Mark, what about you?
Yeah, I guess I would the couple of things I would add, and this is maybe more from the perspective that I have, is every artist, every creator is their own entrepreneur. I mean, they're all kind of their own little startups in a lot of ways. And I think it's important to kind of position yourself that way to continue to educate and not just look at the business as like, this is going to happen around me. It's something you can participate in. And kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, get involved early, get involved in just a few of the Discord groups that maybe you haven't been as involved in. And try to keep up with it. Yeah, it can be a lot, but it's worth it. And the education that you get in a year's time is you can't describe it. And it's hard to look back. I mean, even for me, I'm looking back and going like, man, how could I have not seen this before? How can I put this forward? And I was saying before, and not everybody thought streaming was going to be the answer. Early on, it was really not like the first thing that people thought, yeah, that's definitely going to be the biggest way that we listen to music. And there were early artists that were adopting it really, really early and working with early Spotify or Rhapsody or wherever. And whether the program that they had worked or didn't work didn't really matter. It was that they were learning the new music business, and their teams were. And then now, at the time, like getting 1 million streams was a huge deal at the time. And then now it's like, I'm looking at SoundXYZ and I'm like, man, they got sold 1,000 NFTs this week. That's great. Like, good for them. They know how this can work. And I think it comes back to, again, knowing where your fan base is coming from, getting that feedback and saying, this is what we need to be doing again, or we need to go further into this, or we need to educate them on this, or what can we do to make sure that we're positioning ourselves for not just today, but for the future. And I think that's like the real opportunity that I hope a lot of artists and their team members and labels or whoever, honestly, everybody, I think should have a base layer of this knowledge, because I do think it will be a part of the future. Whether it's the whole future or not, that's to be seen. But again, I think in a lot of ways, there were some people that were shutting off streaming until it was too late. And then, it kind of passed them by, and, you'd always have to catch up. Same with social media. I was kind of that guy was like, man, like TikTok, I don't know if it's my thing, but it looks like everyone else is using it. So we got to learn it. And not saying that that's, it was the be all end all, but it actually did prove to be, what fans wanted, what people wanted to watch on. And so I think it's important to make sure that we're continuing to go down that road.
Yeah, thank you both so much. Definitely to like zoom out just for a second, definitely in like any like studies on innovation and tech innovation, the people who have like kind of progressed the most or kind of been the best position with respect to innovation were just very scrappy. Yeah, they're getting their hands dirty, just being very open to experimentation, just like, rapidly iterating and prototyping, seeing what does and doesn't work. Yeah, we've definitely seen that in terms of what's been effective in Web3 as well. So we definitely encourage that, that mindset. With that, we have a ton of questions, audience questions that I'd like to dive into. It also seems to have been addressed, but I also just want to say out loud, this is a very polarizing topic, and it's kind of playing out in the chat right now in terms of like back and forth debates. Like as Water Music, we like most certainly welcome debates and have like been home to them, but just ask that people be respectful of each other. No like direct attacks on each other. Just as long as you're being respectful and constructive, like please keep the conversation going. But just want to call that out as we approach the last 20 or so minutes. So I'm going to go down, just also as a disclaimer of how I'm going to address these questions. I'm going to go down in order of submission, and if there are very common themes across multiple questions, I'm going to address them all at once. I kind of mark them all as answered, just to make the best use of time. So first submitted question is from Gautier. As Web3 expands and projects multiply, it seems scam projects have had a negative impact on the overall industry adoption. For the future, how do you see the curation and identification of legitimate projects and companies happen to help non-experts navigate the field and get on board with the projects worth investing time and efforts in? Great question. Open to either of you or both.
Yeah, I can maybe grab that one. Having done business development for the time I have, and seen early iterations from early streaming platforms and download platforms to start with, so ownership, and then transferring to access, which is streaming, and the promise of mobile personalization along the way there, and various different iterations. There's always going to be bad actors in the mix, and you kind of do need to tread that carefully. One of the key things to always do, and I've sort of had this as a mantra throughout the years, is to do a very thorough background check on who we're working with. Also get industry and peer reviews on folks who may have worked in previous startups or created different opportunities. And that's, just basically doing your diligence if you're planning to move forward with folks. And I think it's a fair question. It's not new, and it's not just tied to Web3 or blockchain. This is sort of a big challenge, I suppose, with any technology, and has existed for many years. So really just going deep on understanding who you're working with, how they're financed, what their objectives are, and really can they also then back up what they have on PowerPoint. I see a lot of folks who come with slideware, but then can't really back it up. And so just doing your diligence is the key thing.
Yeah, DYOR, right? Do your own research. And I mean, it also be a part of the groups like Water Music, or a group of a network that you can ask these questions to. Hey, has anybody else seen this? What are you guys working on? Have you guys seen this company before? I think that's important. And also in a lot of cases, this is maybe just like a general piece of advice that I think for me, I've kept is just have a dating period. Like if somebody's asking you to sign up for something and you have to sign up like literally that week, it's like, dude, like, do you really want to work together? Like what's happening? So I think in some ways, if you have that like 3, 4, 5 month dating period that you're like, oh, I'm going to watch it this amount of time. So I think just building that in to whatever you're trying to accomplish is important to recognize that you should have, an extended period of time when something is new to be able to watch it and pay attention to what it's doing. And, you know, at the end of the day, recognize that it's an experiment and don't set yourself up where you could lose everything. But the idea is to kind of give yourself an opportunity to succeed out of something. And I think in this current state, especially in Web3, experimentation is the number one way to move forward and learn what you're trying to do. Whether it works or not, you know, we'll find out.
Yeah, thanks both. I will also be stealing the word slideware. Great word. Very widely applicable, unfortunately. Next question, a couple of different ones, and I think it'd be best for today to focus on like the public sector part. So I'll read the whole thing out loud. From an anonymous attendee. Who does SoundExchange see as their main competitors? And how do they assess the potential of Web3 music rights infrastructure being facilitated to some extent by the public sector? In this context, how do they assess the direction the EU has taken, for example, with the Data Governance Act and its blockchain and data spaces strategy?
All right. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, and there's well, I guess the way I approach it first to kind of look at sort of what the competition is. Well, it really depends on the use case. And sometimes who you would consider competition, I've seen this many times throughout my career. Sometimes the folks that you see as your competition may actually turn out to be collaborators and partners in a given venture. And when I look at you know, Web3 specifically, leaving sort of the broader business outside of it, at this point in time, we're at a very nascent stage of a commercial, how should I say, scale. And at this point in time, I don't really look at this particular space from a competition perspective. I look at it from a perspective of who can I collaborate with? And it's about building basically a community. It's about building folks that bring different pieces to the equation. So, you know, from a competitive perspective, maybe that's down the line at some point in time as far as Web3 is concerned. But when I'm looking at what opportunities could actually launch and go to market and where we could be a valuable contributor, I tried to kind of flip the script and say, hey, how can I get more people involved in this? How can I get different sort of skill sets involved in this to ultimately do what we as SoundExchange want to do, which is to drive value for the stakeholders that we represent. Ultimately, the creators and the folks that drive their livelihood from music.
I think that was the perfect answer. I loved it.
Cool. No, great. Very holistic answer. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to combine the next two questions because they are related to, I think, an important point about you going back to the point of not treating the Web3 landscape as a monolith, just addressing the way that independent artists versus major label artists have approached Web3 or have been open to Web3 have been very different. And I mean, as with artist strategy in general, there's no cookie cutter kind of formula. That said, I think there also is general agreement that like we're very far from any notion of like mass adoption of Web3. So from both of your perspectives, what are you seeing as an obstacle in getting larger artists and also their fan bases onboarded into Web3? And maybe is there any lessons that could be learned from the independent artists who have already gotten really scrappy and kind of made waves in Web3, or are they kind of two totally separate paths? How do you understand that?
Yeah, I guess I would just say that, of course, there's so many things that I think major label artists or labeled artists can learn from the way that independent artists work. I think that has kind of informed the way that we work through the industry now. I mean, 5 years ago, the strategy, or maybe not before TikTok, the strategy was how do we get this song up on a playlist? Now it's how do we get a song to go viral on TikTok? That came from the independent space. That didn't come from some big strategy all the way down. And so I think in in the same breath, I think we're kind of seeing the infancy of independent artists experimenting in this space, and the big ones will pop off just like we've seen on every platform the last 15 years. You've seen the ones that can really blow up from that. I'm hopeful. I think in some ways it's a little bit of risk aversion and understanding that not everything's figured out. And when you're doing at a large scale, like at a major label artist would do, it's not always as straight in line, this is going to work and the user experience is going to be great. You're just not sure. So I think in some ways it's about kind of showing how obviously independent artists can do it on a scale of 100 artists, 1,000 artists, 10,000 artists. But when you get to that million or that 10 million or that 100 million level, that's a lot of different questions that come up. And obviously even just not even just rights and all those things, but even just the interfaces and the products that we're using. So I think in a lot of ways it's just about informing each other on that. And I think what I've seen from the independent community and in the label side, understanding that, it's about education, it's about experimentation, and just continuing down that road.
Yeah, and I agree with that. And I'd just continue in saying, look, everyone's journey is different, right? Everyone has a different type of fan base. Everyone has different things that may be applicable. Your contractual situation may be very different, that hinders you from being able to do things or puts you in a position that you really are able to move things forward. So I think everyone's journey is a little bit different from this perspective. But yeah, I agree to a large extent with what Marc put forth, just adding those couple of things.
Great. Yeah, thank you both so much. Next questions. I'm going to combine two. There've been a bunch of questions about this notion of like an open source rights database. So Stephanie had a question: has there been any thought put into creating an open source database of rights holders? This doesn't require Web3, but the blockchain would add a level of truth and immutability that could help. And further down, there's a question: how do we get access to this database? Because I'm sure everyone in the industry would love to get access. And then there was another question I'll just flag about like lessons learned from previous attempts. Because yeah, there've been previous attempts to do this without Web3. So yeah, just combining all those two. Have you looked into that? Is that something you're kind of working on right now from like an industry collaboration perspective?
Yeah, I mean, from looking at what SoundExchange does today, we host a number of different data sets, be it sound recording data, publishing data, usage data, and there's a lot of stuff that we kind of go through on a weekly basis to be able to do what we do in our core business. And obviously there's multiple different conversations going on about different ways of what the future will look like. We don't have a public stance on what we feel would be the best way to move forward at this point in time anyway. But there's a number of different conversations going on with different stakeholders. The interesting thing, or the challenging thing, I would say that you kind of could layer onto this conversation, that we're not just talking about North America. Even just look at who's on this webcast here today. We got half the world represented probably here. There's different rights, different legislations, different ways of slicing the pie in various different geographies around the world. And certainly, what SoundExchange has been trying to do in the Web2 space is to make sense of all of this, really, and certainly looking at those key data verticals that I just mentioned. And so I think, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take the competence that we've built over the last 20 years in specifically trying to make sense of this very, very tricky and sometimes messy rights landscape, for lack of a better word, and trying to take the technology that we've built and work with different players in the markets in the areas of, like I said, clearance, payments, matching, and so forth. And I think that's kind of the best way that I can answer it. We don't have a definitive stance on if there should be a database of sorts We're trying to figure all that out with the industry as we kind of go through these different phases here. But what I can say is that we have a very strong backbone in terms of data and intellectual property information at SoundExchange. So it puts us in a good space to be having these conversations right now.
Yeah, totally agree. I think, I mean, again, Tommy's in those conversations on a weekly basis, a monthly basis of, talking with these partners. And again, for me, I'm more on this creator track of understanding that, creators have it a little bit different than everyone else. I don't have to worry about where my paycheck comes from. I don't have to sign up at 10 different places. I don't have to insert data and then also make sure that it's correct. That to me is, as we keep going down this road, I think it's important for us to try, for me as an individual, I think I've tried to make it a little bit more of my work to try to simplify the process as much as possible, and give voice to those creators that are kind of going through that run around of like, man, I've had to do this here, and wait, I thought I already signed up for that, or why do I have to do this? Those are questions that, it seems a little it seems like we have an opportunity to make it a little bit better, a little bit easier. And I'm hopeful that kind of from an industry standpoint, like Tommy's mentioning with partners, I know that that's kind of the goal, is to continue to go down that road. And at the same point, it is complicated and it's not straightforward, and it's important to continue to talk through it and educate ourselves on what the best technology we can use, whether it's this Web 2 side or Web 3 side, and making sure that we're moving forward with it.
Yeah, thank you both. Good segue. I'm gonna actually skip a couple just because I think we kind of addressed some of these topics during the conversation, but Michael has a very good question about how, if at all, you evaluate specific blockchains. So in terms of Web3 use cases and the underlying technology, does SoundExchange have any preference for, say, Polygon, Solana, or Ethereum blockchains, or is the strategy to remain agnostic?
I think the answer is pretty simple. It is really to remain agnostic, and it's to really look at the creative side of this. What value does a service actually provide to the creator, and then from my perspective, also looking at, okay, are there revenue streams there, and how can we implement those on a larger scale? So no, again, we haven't put the flag down on this is the right way to go. We're actually quite agnostic to having those conversations across the board with different players.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think in a lot of ways, some of them offer differing, benefits and pros and cons, and also they have different creator communities currently, so I think in a lot of ways it's about making sure that we're learning from each one. They all have their own kind of ecosystem, and it's important to make sure that we're kind of getting the best of all the world. So I think kind of what Tommy's saying, agnostic is the best way to go currently, and to just keep learning and keep growing that knowledge base, and again learning from the ecosystems that's there. I think that's a really important piece, and I see Todd's down here saying ETH is the best. I mean, again, interoperability could be the future, and it's like, how do we get there? Those are the things that that I think we obviously want to be a part of. I think it's just figuring out the best steps forward.
Yeah, thank you both. This is definitely ongoing debate happening in the water music community. So definitely interested to see how that plays out. Next, I'll go to Leona. I'm saying that correctly. I won't read out, for the sake of time, I won't read out the entire question, but what she mentions, or they mentioned in Indonesia, musicians are shifting to NFTs, focusing on merchandising and fan connections, but there are no cases yet about secondary sales. I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, not just secondary sales, but any implications around like rights transfer or copyright transfer. Could secondary sales be a next revenue stream for artists? And how, if at all, can smart contracts protect the transfer of copyright on secondary markets? It's a very loaded but important question, because I think a lot of people are thinking about that possibility, especially like independent artists. So yeah.
Yeah, I think this isn't a new question to the industry. For the folks on the call that haven't been in the industry or just entering the music industry or have entered the music industry through Web3. The industry has thought about this for many, many years, ever since the birth of digital, right? We had piracy with Napster and LimeWire and all that stuff. Then we had legitimate downloads with Apple and largely driven by Apple and at the time Microsoft and Nokia and partners like this. And the industry was thinking, okay, what is the secondary resale market? Is there a way through then what was called DRM technology to actually facilitate resales and chained or linked sales? And so the industry has been thinking about this for well over almost 2 decades now, to be honest with you. And so, but there's never been a technology that could actually kind of provide that visibility. There's never been a technology that could provide the security. There's never been a technology that could make sure that the intellectual property rights travels as well as the content travels through the various different nodes, for lack of a better word. And now we're in a place where there are a couple of players out there who are looking at this particular space. And when I say content, back in the day, we used to talk about music. Now it can really be any tokenized asset that could be moved along the chain, be it audio, visual, written, et cetera, or even just an access pointer to those that unlocks a server. So there's a lot of different approaches to this, and we've had a few conversations with really interesting partners that are finally trying to solve what this could look like. Fundamentally, for us, from a SoundExchange perspective, it really comes down to those rights and making sure that those rights in those conversations are represented, and making sure that as we potentially get into a world where we see what was back in the day called the super distribution, it really needs to be set up in a way that it supports the intellectual property rights in any given geography. And I keep pointing that out because the world's different, and it needs to have that type of flexibility. So I think it's a really, really good question. There are players out there who are trying to solve for that. From a SoundExchange perspective, again, it really comes down to the data and the protection and sort of the sharing. I shouldn't say protection, but I should say the sharing of intellectual property rights.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, yeah, just to kind of, I guess, maybe put a bow on that. The secondary sales are such an opportunity. I mean, obviously, we've never really had, like you're saying, the technology to do it. And now, whether it's ticketing or merchandise or whatever it is, I'm actually wearing a IYK shirt right now, a tokenized shirt where, yeah, I could technically resell this or technically give it to someone else and they could own it and they could be, be a part of something. And I think, and in that same breath, I think as far as like music goes and the way that you can tokenize your music and share it in a different way, I think now we have that technology. I think it's important to experiment with it. And I think it's important to try different things. Every time I show someone a shirt like this, they're like, man, we could retarget them or we could redo this. And it's like, yeah, exactly. Like that's a very unique opportunity for artists, whether it's a business or an independent artist that wants to, launch another shirt or launch a tour. Well, obviously, if they have your shirt, they probably are going to buy your tickets. So I think that there's a lot of different things that we are coming up on that are going to be such opportunities for so many different types of people in the industry. And I think it's just important to continue to stay educated and stay involved.
Amazing. Great note to end on. I know we're a few minutes over, but thanks so much to, so many of you for staying, to Tommy and Marc also for all the amazing insight and perspective from the work you're doing with SoundExchange and Web3 and beyond. As a final, I guess, question, I think there are a lot of questions we didn't get to, a lot of, I think, curiosity people have about how they could potentially talk more with you, ask follow-up questions. What's the best way to get in touch if they're interested in learning more?
Sure, I'm happy to share with this community my my email. So if anyone has any questions specifically with regard to SoundExchange on how we could collaborate, happy to have conversations with people. My email is T as in Tommy T Korpinen at soundexchange.com. Feel free to drop me a note, and I really appreciate everyone's time today. This is you know, when we're on these types of panels and we're out here talking with Marc, you know, from my perspective, I really also want to make sure that, you know, it goes the other way, and we have the ability to reach out to you guys. So really appreciate your time, everyone. And it was great being here today. Cherie, special thanks to you as well.
Yeah, same for me. M Rucker at SoundExchange.com. Feel free to reach out. Would love to connect with whether you're an artist or a manager or just somebody that's interested in this space. Please reach out. I love talking about this stuff. Obviously, it's a passion of mine. But yeah, just I wanted to say thanks again, Cherie. I mean, obviously these communities aren't built on their own, and I think that it's kind of a product of the people that started it. And you know, in a lot of ways, I appreciate your curiosity to ask the questions and to be a part of the industry in the way that you are. And obviously, talking with everybody else there, you know, Young Spielberg and everybody else. Like, I love the whole group. And if I don't catch you guys on email, I'll see you in the Discord, and I'll see you at the next Water Music webinar.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for the kind words, both of you, Tommy and Marc. Really appreciate it. Yeah, this concludes our session. We'll send out a bunch of follow-up kind of points, additional resources, articles that we've written if you're interested in diving deeper into this topic, and also some contact info for following up, and information on how to join our membership if you would like to take part in the amazing Discord server that Marc mentioned to continue the convo. But yeah, thanks so much again, everyone, and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, bye.